So, your world is ending. That sucks, but not for you. This video was inspired by a comment left by Mousewife Games. So, apocalypses in writing can take on about 1 million different forms, and we've seen tons of them, most commonly as being prevalent in the now infamous YA dystopian genre. Apocalypses don't only have to be about zombies or nukes. Anything from the fall of the Roman Empire to the awakening of Cthulhu can fall into this genre, but one thing unites them all. Whatever the equivalent to your local Waffle House may be, it's bad enough that it isn't open. Any of you who live in the South know how serious the circumstances have to be for a Waffle House to not be open. On a more serious note, there are two main points you can adjust for apocalypses: scale and stage. And we'll be talking about both, so you'll know how to incorporate them into your novel, tabletop RPG campaign, or world-building project. Perhaps I should say world-ending project, but I digress. At the end of the video, I'll briefly talk about my absolute favorite type of apocalypse and fit it in with the criteria that we lay out in the rest of the video. So we'll begin with scale. We'll be measuring this from 1 to 5 and talk about why you might want a more or less literally world-ending apocalypse in your story. So, category 1 is town-sized. It might be fair to say, well, it's hardly an apocalypse if it's only affecting one town, and, well, you're not entirely wrong. But look at it this way. The important thing about an apocalypse is that it is the world of the protagonist that seems to be ending. If their world doesn't really extend outside the place they live in, then an apocalypse that only encompasses said place can be perfectly effective. Oftentimes, if there's an event affecting just one town, it'll take on a more paranormal or esoteric form. One example of this is From, a relatively recent Amazon Prime show. You could also argue that the first Darkest Dungeon game falls into this category. This is because in order for you to be able to sell an apocalypse on such a small scale, there'll have to be something that prevents your protagonist from saying, well, I guess I'm just gonna leave, or it won't be believable. And it can be something that physically prevents them from leaving, but it can also be something where it would be against their character for them to leave. Maybe they have something that they know they must do. Now, unfortunately for our old friend protagonist Von Generic, we'll be blowing up his world a bit in this video in order to show off some examples. So by now, our brave hero has left the town of Playston and moved on to the nearby hamlet of Bad Luckton. As soon as he enters, he sees a black cat, walks under a ladder, and spills some salt. Clouds surround the town of Bad Luckton, and when old Von Generic tries to leave, he finds himself at the entrance of the town once again. Now it's up to him to find out what is causing this and find his way out. Category 2, regional. Once you expand the scale out to a regional level, you give yourself a fair amount more options, but still reside in a lesser used middle ground of apocalyptic storytelling. At a regional level, one of the first things that comes to mind for me would be a disastrous weather event or something similar. A story about living through a hurricane or tornado, while not a literal apocalypse, would definitely fit the bill as far as how it could feel. The apocalypse is now big enough that it's affecting several distant, disparate areas, but small enough that surrounding areas may be capable of helping. Perhaps relief efforts are organized from the outside, or if it's something like a plague, perhaps those inside the region are quarantined and not allowed to leave. Depending on if there's any value presented by the cause of the problem, you may also have opportunists entering the area seeking to enrich themselves. Stalker is an excellent example of this. Any of these options can create interesting conflicts. Is your hero having to enter into the zone of a meteor landing, or are they trying to escape the quarantine area of a plague, hoping they can do so before they too are infected? So protagonist Von Generic's Bad Luckton problem gets solved pretty quickly when a tornado inexplicably rolls through, decimating the town and whatever was causing him to not be able to leave. Unfortunately, as the fog clears, he sees that the destruction is now spread far and wide. As he wanders the roads, he searches for what has been causing all of these disasters, only encountering devastation in its wake. Category 3, National. Given that national is in a sense the strictest barrier for entry as far as scale goes, as it requires the chaos to be limited by a country's borders, a national apocalypse will have a few expected types. The primary one is a political or societal apocalypse. Perhaps there's a violent revolution or even a devastating civil war. In either case, it may only affect one specific country, but there is absolute chaos. Roving bands of marauders may roam the streets, or major battles may be fought in every city. Your characters might be participants, but they also could be stuck in the middle, trying to find a way to make peace or seek a way out. While outside reactions may resemble those you'd see in regional level apocalypses, you also have to consider that one might see rival nations seeking to exploit the weakness of their neighbor. Perhaps another invading force adds fuel to the flame, or perhaps the apocalypse itself is the protagonist's home country being invaded by a stronger neighbor. As protagonist wanders the broken roads outside Bad Luckton, he finds out from some refugees he meets on the road that the King of Kingia did an unthinkable thing. He cast down his crown, the hat of ultimate bigness, causing a curse to befall the land. Now protagonist worries if Koltia, Kingia's ever-aggressive neighbor, will invade the land to make things even worse. Category 4. Continental. Once we reach the Continental level, the apocalypse is definitely growing closer to existential. This is definitely where you start to see more of your plagues and zombies and that sort of thing. They're spread wide enough that there's no hope of finding safety nearby, but it hasn't consumed the world. There's often a near mythical safe place somewhere beyond the ocean or over the mountains or some other such long distance away. It's a great primer for a story as it has a long and arduous journey built right in. At a continental level, you tend to see things like war stop being the cause, unless it's from some overwhelming force, like conquesting aliens or some such. You also may see massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or other large-scale environmental disasters. Even if the chaos itself only affects one continent in particular, it's likely that it's making life more difficult for the rest of the world as well, which may impact their ability or willingness to get involved. Protagonist Von Generic just rolls his eyes when he finds out that actually not only was there that fog, and a bunch of tornadoes, and a curse upon the land, and an invasion from Koltia, but now there's a massive plague that has been unleashed upon the world, forcing everyone to breakdance until they die of exhaustion. Protagonist begins to wonder if his world is not one of free will or benevolent gods, but one controlled by the whims of some insane megalomaniacal deity. Category 5. World. At this level, things are pretty well screwed. Whatever's going on is going on everywhere, and if there is a safe place to go, it's very small, hard to get to, and probably doesn't let everyone in. The problem probably will not get solved for generations, or even if it can be fixed, recovery will still take a long time. Large portions of the population may be gone, institutions are a distant memory, and it strongly seems like things will never be the same again. World-shaking apocalypses are so varied in their causes that it's more effective to talk about how to handle them. Cormac McCarthy's The Road is probably my favorite example of an apocalypse for this reason. The disaster itself is never really named, though it is implied to be a nuclear disaster. Instead, the story focuses on the relationship between a father and a son as they venture through a broken world. When doing world-ending apocalypses, it's worth considering your endpoint. That is to say, is it actually the end of the world period, or just the end of the world as we know it? When going with something as dramatic as ending the world, it's definitely worth giving a lot of thought to how you want to portray it. It can be one of the most stark ways to make the point of your story hit home. Protagonist isn't even surprised when he hears that a giant squid monster from beyond the world appears in the sky, rapidly approaching the world to consume it in one fell swoop. Protagonist hardly even cares at this point and is too busy breakdancing because he caught the plague from earlier. Fortunately for him, because we now have to talk about the stages of an apocalypse, all of the problems disappear with no warning or explanation. In utter disbelief, protagonist decides to have a stiff drink, or 12. So protagonist gets to live another day, as we're now going to finish our discussion on making the end of the world by talking about the stages in which it happens, and how each of them can affect your story, starting with Stage 1, Pre-Apocalypse. Easily the most neglected part of any apocalypse is the pre-apocalypse, how everything was before the problems started happening. It's reasonable that this period isn't often explored, though. If you're there for a zombie story, you probably want the zombies to come sooner rather than later, rather than hearing about how everything was normal for the first half of the story. However, if your apocalypse isn't one sudden event, but instead the culmination of a great deal of factors, spending time in the pre-apocalypse can be fascinating and bring about a kind of tension you won't get anywhere else. I've done this with my novel series, where a crisis is brewing on a continental level that threatens to overturn a millennium-long status quo. But the story doesn't begin with that threat spilling over. Instead, it starts a few years before that, where all the pieces of what will one day cause everything to change are being put together. Different characters begin discovering the cracks as they form and prepare for how they'll react to them, but nobody knows the full extent of what's going to happen. And that kind of tension is very fun to write, and it makes the apocalypse itself all the more impactful when it comes. Then, of course, you've got to have Stage 2, the apocalypse. This is where you work out the actual details of what happens. Is it a plague, a natural disaster, a war, a revolution, or something else? More importantly, if you're working with specific characters rather than a world as a whole, how does this event affect them? Did they see it coming, or did it come out of nowhere? Do they escape relatively unscathed, or do they lose almost everything in the process? How do the details of the apocalypse relate to their character traits? Are they someone who is fired up to join the military, but when their country's invaded and decimated, they lose the will to fight? Were they a doctor who tried and failed to prevent the spread of a deadly disease? Perhaps they predicted everything long before it happened and nobody listened to them. How these feelings affect them will determine a lot about the tone of your novel and give your characters room to grow and change as the plot progresses. Stage 3, then, is the post-apocalypse. Everything has happened now and the main outburst is finished. The danger may persist in the form of the invading army's continued attacks or the plague still posing a major threat, but the setting has by now felt the effects of the apocalypse and normality has been fully eliminated. You aren't in Kansas anymore because Kansas got blown up and turned into a nuclear hellscape, which is questionable because what is there to even blow up in Kansas? But this is the broadest stage as you might expect because in the majority of cases this is where most of your story is going to be. Your characters now live in a different world and you're either trying to change it back to how it was, into something better, or merely survive it. There are so many possibilities that I could easily make a video on the post-apocalypse alone, and maybe I will at some point. One thing I do want to specifically touch on though is the idea of reflection. Your characters probably should, at some point, have some thoughts about how the world was before. Sure, they probably missed the comforts of it, especially if it was a fairly modern or advanced society, but how is it doing, really? Was it a time of progress and prosperity brought low by the cause of the world's end? Or were things not so good and the apocalypse was merely the logical conclusion of a long line of misfortunes? In either case, your characters will have to reckon with how they can bear to continue on in this new world, and it often determines whether or not they want to try and bring things back to the way they were, or forge a new future totally unlike that which has been seen before. Before we finish out the video, I'm going to briefly talk about my favorite type of apocalypse, which you may be amused to know is the reason that the thumbnail is the way it is, and that is something along the lines of the rapture. It may just affect me more because of my personal beliefs, but the idea of ultimate judgment coming down on the world in the form of a battle between angels and demons, the world breaking apart, will never not be baller. We can even easily categorize it with our little system here. It's obviously a Category 5 world-ending apocalypse, which would likely focus on the first two stages, as a raptured world likely wouldn't have too much of a post-apocalypse. All I can say is if my fantasy world ever goes out, it's going out like that. Overall, apocalypses can be some of the most varied types of stories imaginable. While they have their tropes and overplayed expectations, there are tons of creative things you can do with them to put characters in entirely new types of situations. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing and tell me about how your world will end in the comments below. Thank you for taking a chance on a small channel, and I don't have anything to remind you to remember this time, so I don't know, I'll just leave you with this.
Holy shit! Holy shit!